The spiritual lessons of learning, relearning, and unlearning. Passages from Romans 8 and Proverbs 1 today, and I'm going to begin with Proverbs 1, one particular line, actually two, the last two lines read to us from Proverbs 1. It's no accident at all. It's very intentional that Proverbs, the book of wisdom, begins with the proverb that it does. Short, to the point, and lets the reader know how to prepare themselves for the proverbs that they're going to be reading. Let the wise also hear and gain instruction, and let the discerning acquire guidance, so that they can discern the meaning of a proverb and a parable and the sayings of the wise and their riddles. So when you look at that text carefully, it is an admonition, an encouragement to the wise to remember that they need to receive instruction continually in order to understand wisdom. You would think that the wise would have that down and they would just share the wisdom, but the Proverbs basically is telling us that wisdom is something we always pursue, and that the wise can be wise one day and a fool the next day. And so while the beginning verses talk to those who are without understanding to varying degrees, the proverb ends with a reminder to those who are considered wise, believe themselves to be wise, are in positions where they share wisdom, to remember that they need to follow wisdom themselves. So what this tells me in the context of the sermon title is that all of us at just different times in our lives are learning, relearning, and or unlearning. And I say this now when we're in the midst of great trepidation and panic about returning to school, and very understandably so. There's so much on the line right now for families in the United States and around the world with going back to school. And as we know, some are going to learn online and some are going to start out in classes, and we're going to see what the future holds. But in any case, the return to school is going to be an emphatic experience for the students and the teachers of relearning and unlearning things. It's going to be a challenge for the teachers as much as the students. So I want to think of them as we go through this ourselves, that we are in a broader context of our society all being engaged in this learning and unlearning kind of situation. It's also true for when we start a new job, things of a much lesser kind of severe situation than a pandemic. When we begin new relationships or new collaborations, or like I say, jobs, it can sometimes require a relearning or an unlearning. We move from one job to another, and things are done differently, and you learn new protocols. So that's kind of at a basic level, but that's important that we have that capacity to do that. On a more profound and severe end of this, I unfortunately have three friends who have suffered brain injuries for different reasons in different years of their lives, teens, 20s, and 60s. Car crash, accident, stroke. And in each one of these situations, brain injury relearning is a profound experience for them and for everyone that has to go through that. And while that's not exactly what I'm talking about with learning and relearning in the everyday life, there is a relationship there, and there is an analogy there that I think is important. One of those things is, I remember that those who work through brain injury rehabilitation, it's emotionally very difficult. And so there's a lot of anxiety and dealing with just the anxiety part in order to do the relearning part. It's very trying. And that is true for other circumstances where we have to relearn or unlearn something. It can well up anxiety because we're not certain. It's going to ask us to do something differently than the way we've done it our whole lives, and it's worked really well for us, we thought. But anxiety and relearning and unlearning are a shared experience, but there's a need to overcome that anxiety, of course, if we're going to effectively do as the proverb suggests and continue to follow wisdom all of our lives. This is also applicable to racial justice. And for those who were in the first conversation, I think they'll have no problem hooking into that thought that as we begin to talk about racial justice, one of the things that comes up is how uninformed we discover we are as white people about the Black experience and Black history. Uninformed. The things that we learned about racial relationships and the Black community is not only that it's not enough, that we need more Black history, it's that we need to relearn because some of what we've learned about racial justice has not been true. And that's hard to get used to as well. And that can cause anxieties as well for us when we're trying to unlearn the way that we have talked about and thought about white privilege and racial discrimination. Last example I'd use for all of us is growing older. I barely need to explain that one because for those of us who are growing older, it feels like it's a weekly request to relearn or unlearn something. And that part never stops really in our growing older. And so this concept or this experience of hanging on to what we've learned, of relearning what we've learned, and casting away things that we learned that we thought were beneficial, it was beneficial knowledge, this is not easy work to do. And it's intentional. It must be intentional. I remember as a wrestling coach, I've used wrestling analogies with you before, that the wrestlers who come to college, which is a high level of competition, come with real varying degrees of skills. And in some cases, many of the teen wrestlers moving into college not only are learning new things, but they have to unlearn habits. And in sport, that's really difficult sometimes. Something that seemed to work for you before in a certain way of reacting with your body seems good, but then you have to, change, and your habit has to actually take you the opposite direction of the direction you thought you were supposed to go. So there's many analogies that we can use for it in life. It can be disorienting when we find ourselves in a place of having to learn a lot of new things quickly. But this is life. It is a place where we can learn not only new things about racial justice and ourselves, but also very basic daily things. When I think about the spectrum of, dealing with life situations that require great patience because they are so frustrating, that requires a learning curve with it too. And I would say even in our loving and in our kindnesses, that maybe there's certain ways or things we've done to express our love and kindness that also could use some relearning about how we do that. So at every level of our lives, I think there's something that can be gained by understanding that we have this onus on us to realize that the things that we've learned for so long continue to help us, but also are in need of change. Romans 8. This is a fantastic passage. I'm going to read some select verses in it, not the whole thing that was read before. And this is an incredible passage, and I want to tell you up front that are sections of it I can't really explain to you, and I encourage you to read all of Romans 8. Paul says some really heady things in there that I really need to think about further. But one of the lines in there is perhaps one of the most memorized, cherished lines in Christian speak that you are familiar with. And Sean, we're going to cut that right there because this lawnmower guy's coming through. It's 10 minutes and 23 seconds. And it was right before I was going to read Romans 8:26. So, second half coming in a moment.